joining me on Extraplasm podcast and revisiting the podcast for the first time in many months because he's been off drawing giant lizards that stomp through Tokyo and other things. Friend of the podcast, awesome person, comic book artist, culture critic, great human being, John Yurcaba 4 is back for another episode. How are you doing, John Yurcaba?
I am doing really well, and as always, I am honored to be here with you.
I am glad you're here. I appreciate you making time. And for those who are listening at home, you should know that John seriously has made time because we've both watched John experience technological failure in all capacities this evening, as everything that he has touched has seemed to not work. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but there's a Yiddish term that I learned when I was coaching debate years ago from a kid, one of my students. He told me that he had a thing called the kavorka.
Oh, gosh.
And I said, He said, what is the kavorka? And he said, it's like a Yiddish curse. It means if you touch any technology, it just stops working. So I think you might have a case of the kavorka. You might have to go get purged.
I probably need blessings from every holy person in a 10-mile radius. Something, man. It's been a trip to get to this point, to just hit record.
You need to go get a stack of SD cards, a bottle of, holy water, and a lot of sage. And you have to do some sort of weird digital ritual in order to get your technology to cooperate. Exorcism. But I appreciate you making the effort to come on the podcast because I know that tonight has been a bit of a challenge to make it work. And for those of you wondering, you're like, how long of a challenge? Like a few hours. We've been trying to figure out what's wrong with John's computer. So
no, it's all good though, and I'm seriously happy to be here. Whatever was within my power to make this happen, I was willing to do. So I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah. So thank you for going to the backup method of doing Riverside via app so we could still have a conversation. And I was excited to talk to you, especially because for those who've been trying to figure out for the last few weeks, you kept hearing strange possessed noises in the podcast that I didn't know about. Presumably, I had no idea that there was weird things trickling into the podcast in the middle of the headline segment. All of that has been because, John, you've been working up to this little thing called Ectober, which we're going to talk about. So, yeah, but before we get into Ectober stuff, which we are going to talk about, and some of you are like, oh, that's what the payoff of that is? Yes, that's what the payoff of that is, that we're going to talk about Ectober. Like, what has been all this possessed noise on the podcast? That's because Ectober's coming. But I did want to talk with you a bit about, what's been going on with you, where you've been. I know you've been drawing Godzilla a lot. How's that been going for you?
It's been going really well, actually. The trade paperback of a comic series, a Godzilla comic series that I did called Monsters and Protectors, All Hail the King, that came out toward the end of August. And so literally those books came out on a Tuesday. And the Saturday after that, I got flown out to Fort Worth to be a part of the first ever Kaiju Go, which is it was a little one-day convention that they did out there that was all very Godzilla, tokusatsu, kaiju focused, and I was one of two artists that were featured at the event, and it was really cool. The crowd was amazing. They were loving it. They showed a couple of movies. They showed one of my favorites. Godzilla versus Megalon, which I really enjoy because it has Jet Jaguar in it, and I love Jet Jaguar. And
nice.
So yeah, it was just a good crowd. There's a lot of really good people, and I had a ton of fun. I grew up in Texas. I lived in Fort Worth for a while. My brother was born in Fort Worth, and it was the first time that I'd been back to that area since living there. So it was really cool to be kind of back in the Fort Worth Stockyards area. And also it just was really fun. I went there literally with 30 copies of that book thinking I'll sell a few of these and then I'll come back and I'll do a couple of events here locally in Phoenix. And then whatever copies I have left, I'll just hang on to those and that'll be for my table at, future conventions and events and stuff.
Right.
All of those books were signed and gone out the door within 2 hours of me being there. It was absolute insanity. And And, you know, I got to, the other artist that was there was Bob Eggleton, who he is just, odds are if you like in your head, picture anytime you've seen like a painted, like a very painterly, almost like oil painting, watercolor painting of Godzilla, like a movie poster or a book illustration or something. Odds are you're probably thinking of something that Bob did. Like his
Gotcha.
work on those characters and those monsters is iconic. And so to get to share that space with him, and also like I got to go out to lunch with him and just hang out with him, and we did like a Q&A, like, you know, not a lecture, but you know, it was a packed, like they had the event in this like one screen theater that had like a lobby area where they had all the booths and tables set up, and there's a lot of like people that had just like Sofubi, you know, soft vinyl collectible toys and all this kind of stuff. And so the theater was packed. They were in there for the screening of one of the movies, but before the movie, Bob and I were in there talking to everybody, and just everybody was just super hyped to like talk to us and ask questions and everything.
Nice.
So it was a really good experience. I had a lot of fun.
That's awesome. So now that you've been well seasoned at, you know, doing Godzilla comic work and going and representing the Godzilla fandom, are you ready to like engage in kaiju warfare? Like, you're gonna bring Stay Puft into the Godzilla world? Like, are you gonna bring Godzilla into the Stay Puft world? Like,
I honestly,
is that a thing we get to see?
I think that's something that should be avoided at all costs, because in all honesty, Stay Puft shows up and he wrecks stuff. Like, he's made of marshmallow and ectoplasm, and Godzilla will like incinerate him from a mile away. Like, that's a fight that should be avoided at all costs, in all honesty.
Can you count? Oh, this is a great question. I think I asked this question of I might ask this question to Jacob Walsh when he was on a while back, because he's a huge Godzilla fan.
Mm-hmm.
But like, would you constitute the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man as a kaiju? Like, does he fit into that categorization?
I think technically he does. I mean, he is, for all intents and purposes, he's a big monster. He's like a larger than,
Yeah.
you know, normal monster, which is kind of the gist of what a kaiju is. I was watching a YouTube video not too long ago that it posed the question, is Paul Bunyan a kaiju? And I started watching it, and I was like, I'm intrigued by this. And they brought up Babe the Blue Ox and said, like, for sure Babe is a kaiju, but let's talk about Paul. And I don't think I ever finished the video. I need to go back and watch it, because this conversation literally just made me remember it. But I think that's
see, now you have me thinking, like, does that mean that like the Jolly Green Giant is also
potentially
a kaiju?
I mean, if Paul Bunyan is, I would say for sure the Jolly Green Giant is.
I feel like that's a showdown, by the way. Like, the Jolly Green Giant versus the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man should be like a battle for the nutritional souls of America.
Oh man, sugar versus fiber.
Which of the food groups will you align yourself with?
Oh my goodness.
The green or the dark arts? I don't know.
No, man, calling it the green just makes it sound like we're talking about like Swamp Thing and like the primordial forces of the DC universe. But like, instead of like Swamp Thing representing the green, it's the Jolly Green Giant.
Right. Exactly.
Oh man.
Hey, I think this is fine. This is something you should definitely get to work on drawing. You know, like, that's your next print is Stay Puft versus the Jolly Green Giant versus, I don't know, who would be the third? Who's another Bob's Big Boy, like the big boy from Bob's.
Oh man, that's such a
three of them in a triple
matchup.
threat match.
Oh geez.
Hey, you can do this now. You've been dabbled in kaiju. Like, you've now like put that as a notch on your drawing belt. And so that means that you are now authorized to create said works. You know, that's some kaiju artist board of approval now says that's allowed. Or if they don't, I do. So fine.
Boy, that's the part that matters.
Yeah. So, well, I think it's cool that you've been working on Godzilla stuff, and I have to admit, like, my Godzilla knowledge is weak. What I remember of Godzilla comes from VHS cassettes that escaped from a video store that went out of business when I was a kid because my dad worked there and just was like, here, let's get all the Godzilla for your cousins when we go out of business. And so Godzilla tapes lived at my grandmother's house and were a thing that I only saw there on an old VHS player that had like a pop-up. Remember the pop-up VHS?
Yeah.
Not the one you put the thing in the front, but it had like the drawer, the the cassette on top.
We had VHS players that they went in the front, but we had a separate, because like you could obviously like rewind the VHS tape when it was in the VCR, but we also had this separate, just like a rewinder. It was this thing where it was and it popped open from the top. And we had two. We had one that was just kind of like black. Oh man, thinking about this is a trip. I haven't thought about this in forever. Feels like such a specific, like maybe not even everybody in the 90s knew what this was, but like it was like a separate thing. We had one that was just black, and you put the tape in there and you'd shut it, and it would rewind at like high speed just to like get it back to the beginning of the tape. We had one that was just black.
And you gotta be kind.
Yeah. We had one that was just black, and then we had one that looked like a race car. And the race car one was attached to like the TV that the kids watched upstairs in the game room. And then the black one was downstairs with like the living room TV.
Gotcha.
But
we had a fleet of those when my father worked at the video store.
Nice.
One of my jobs was like, here's a stack of tapes, rewind them. Yep. So I remember the pop-up rewinder very well. These are like, back in my day, kids, when you were accessing media, you had to rewind it back to the beginning. You couldn't just scrub around inside of it and choose where you wanted to go.
I feel like there's so much now that it's unavoidable. Like I have always loved that, like, I wake up every day, I watch cartoons for research, I watch nerdy movies, I draw comics, people pay me to do all this stuff that, like, it keeps me young. Like, it makes me feel like my childhood never ended. And then every once in a while we have a conversation like this, and I'm just like, oh man. But then I'm like, dude, you're 35. Like, you're not old. But then, like, someone will say something, like someone younger than me will say something, and it's just like, objectively, maybe I'm not old, but like, whatever just came out of their mouth, like, I support you. I support your right to, like, speak your language and your truth, but I'm lost. Can you explain?